Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Your Mark on the World show. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe, and our guest today is one that I've been excited about for months. I've been recruiting to try and get him on the show, but our guest today is Austin Myers. He's a recent Stanford graduate with a master's degree in journalism who won the very coveted Win a Trip contest with the New York Times and Nicholas Kristof. Austin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Devin. This is great.
We're thrilled to have you. So, Austin, tell us a little bit about Nick Kristof, because I know he's famous, and you and I know who he is, and yes. I think everybody should, but not everybody does. Let's be honest. So, tell everybody who Nick Kristof is.
Sure. So, Nicholas Kristof is a columnist for the New York Times. And he does most of his columns and most of what he writes about are about issues of social injustice, human rights abuses. He does a lot of reporting in the developing world, exposing issues that aren't getting covered enough in mainstream media. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, probably most famous for his book that he wrote with his wife called Half the Sky, which is a book about the kind of the oppression of women around the world. And he also just came out with a new book pretty recently called A Path Appears, which is an amazing book. And that is talking about the best practices to make social impact. And where people can volunteer their time to have the most impact, or where they can donate, and holding charities and nonprofits accountable and measuring impact. And so I've been a fan of his for a long time, and this was such a blessing to be able to go on this trip with him.
So tell us about the competition. How did you win this opportunity?
So this is a competition that Nick's been doing with the New York Times for about 8 or 9 years, I think. And I had heard about it a few years ago because my mom is a big Nick Kristof fan and told me about it. But at the time I was playing soccer I was on the soccer team at Stanford. And so my summers were always spent playing soccer, and I never had the opportunity to apply. And I always thought, oh, that'd be so cool though. And then after my senior season with the soccer team, I kind of had a summer, and I was thinking, what could I do? And ended up applying. And so what the application was you could do an essay under 700 words, or you could do a video under 3 minutes, or you could do both. So I ended up doing both, and I tried to show in the video a little bit about my personality, the things I'm interested in, whether it was soccer or improv theater, storytelling. And because I thought, like, hey, he has to travel with this person for a few weeks, so he's going to want to know that the person's kind of fun and can laugh. And I also wanted to show that the stories I'm interested in telling are really to shed light for those who don't have a voice of their own. And my essay that I wrote took a lot of inspiration actually from this graduation speech that I heard when I graduated Stanford. After my senior year, Bill and Melinda Gates spoke at Stanford, and it was really inspiring to me. And Melinda Gates had this quote that she said, in the course of your life, you're going to witness suffering. And when that happens, don't turn away from it, because that is the moment change is born. And that just struck me so powerfully. And I wanted, after my senior year, to turn towards suffering. In my essay, I talked about how I have lived such a privileged life with the family I've grown up with the opportunities I've had to go to Stanford, to have, such an amazing support system. But I knew that to be inspired to make the kind of change I wanted to make in the world, I really needed to get out of my comfort zone and turn towards that suffering, and see that hardship face to face. So in my essay, I talked about the drive to do that, and how I wanted that to really change me as a person and utilize my abilities as a writer and multimedia journalist to tell those types of stories.
So is it just a single round? You submitted those 2 application elements, and then one day you got a call, or was there a finals round, a hand-to-hand combat at some point? How was the final winner chosen?
So yeah, I think the Center for Global Development helped them winnow down the applicants into like a finals pool, and a few months after the initial application, I found out that I was one of 3 finalists. And at that point, I had to send in my transcripts and get a reference for Kristof to speak to. And then a few days later after that, I was working at the Stanford Design School. I was in this little room, and suddenly I got a call on my phone from a number in New York, and I did not put it together at all. But I answered the phone, and he said it was Nick from the New York Times, and I like literally just dropped to my knees. I was like so shocked. But thankfully he kind of took the conversation from there, because I didn't really I was pretty speechless.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Now, I may have given some people the impression, as I talk about winning a trip and traveling with Nick Kristof, that this was some sort of vacation. This was a working gig. Tell us a little bit about what it was like. Now, I think you did 2 trips with him, actually, a little trip to Baltimore and then a long trip to India and Nepal. Tell us a little bit about how that went.
Yeah. The trip was absolutely amazing. So we started by going to Baltimore in early June, and this was pretty recently after the riots in Baltimore occurred. And we went for 3 days, and we went to cover issues related to urban poverty. And this was the first time that actually Nick has taken a win-a-trip winner to an American city. And he wanted to do so because he wanted to stress that, you know, inequality and poverty happens here in the United States too. It's not something that you have to travel around the world to see. So we went to Baltimore, and we spent a lot of time reporting on drug overdoses and drug abuse. We really looked into the rise in heroin abuse. Heroin deaths have like tripled over the last 3 years. And so we were trying to get a sense of, you know, on the ground level, what's the cause of that. And we also were kind of covering in Baltimore this narrative of personal choice, how many affluent Americans think that, you know, people are always personally to blame for the bad choices they make. And we were kind of wanting to tell the story about, you know, it's more nuanced than that, that there are ways that people are put behind the 8 ball before they even come into this world, that is caused by inequality. And we wanted to kind of show that side of the issue. And so in Baltimore, and as well as India and Nepal, it definitely was a working trip. Like when I was with Nick, he was the nicest guy ever, but he wasn't like chatting me up like, yo, what's going on, Austin? How you doing? You know, it was like he was in work mode. And I was so happy to be along for that, because I got to witness, you know, as a journalist who's kind of just entering this world and trying to learn, I got to see what he's like when he is actually, you know, doing the work he puts in. So just to kind of be his shadow, and I would sit in interviews, but I also had the freedom to ask questions that I had. And it was cool to see kind of how my questions sometimes differed from the questions that he would ask. And then in India and Nepal, we were in India for, we went to the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is in northern India. It's a state that I think if it was on its own, would be the 6th most populated country in the world if it was a country.
And desperately poor. It's the poorest state of India, isn't it?
Yeah. I believe so. And so we reported in India, we were reporting on issues related to malnutrition and women's rights. And then we went to Nepal, and we told a story about these 2 doctors who have pioneered this really brilliant way and cost-effective way to do cataract surgeries. And then we returned to Kathmandu in Nepal to report on human trafficking. So it was, you know, a trip that I won, and, you know, thankfully the New York Times was there to financially support me on that trip. But it was really, you know, it was very intense, and I was I was definitely working. I mean, while I was in the India and Nepal trip, for me, I knew that this was such a once in a lifetime opportunity that I was trying to write almost every night. And at some point, I had to realize, because I was getting sleep deprived, that I had to kind of relax and soak it up and take time to appreciate the opportunity just as a person, not as a working journalist.
Yeah. So you actually wrote a half a dozen or more pieces for the New York Times during or following these trips, right? You also did a podcast from Baltimore, or about your experience in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about those articles in the podcast.
Yeah. Let's see. So from Baltimore, I came out with a column that was entitled "My First Trip to a Strip Club." And then I came out with a podcast where I followed this program, which was a mentorship program. And I was going on a ride along through the city with someone from the mentorship program called Thread, as we were trying to find this kid named Dante, who we needed to find him to bring him to his high school where he could enroll in summer courses before he aged out of high school, because he was 21. And that podcast was about that journey through the city, finding him, speaking with him, understanding a little bit about his life, and then reflecting on the challenges in these in places like Sandtown, Winchester, which is where Freddie Gray from the Baltimore riots is from, and also where Dante in this circumstance was from. How difficult it is to get people to choose to go to school instead of sell drugs, and looking at, like, cognitively, it actually makes sense for a lot of them that they choose to sell drugs. So it was understanding that story. And then in India, I did.
Just say that podcast was very well produced. Had a distinctly NPR feel to it. It was really quite brilliant. Did they give you resources at the Times to do that, or did you do that on your own PC?
Yeah, so actually, I did actually do that one on my own, and that was, I just brought my own, like, little digital recorder. And actually, it's funny because that was on the third day in Baltimore, and my flight out was at night, and Kristof's was in the morning. He drove back, so he actually wasn't there for that. But I was feeling all confident and like mini Kristof, and so I was like, oh, I can do this, and I set up kind of an interview to go visit this organization, and ended up kind of joining this guy on this car ride. And I'm a huge This American Life fan and Radio Lab, so I just kind of put myself in that mind state and thought, oh, this is such a radio story. So I just pulled out my recorder and started recording everything.
Yeah, you totally nailed it. I mean, you created echoes of This American Life, for sure. So that was great. So tell us about Nepal and India, and the pieces you wrote about those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in India, when we were covering malnutrition, I did a number of stories on malnutrition. I think the one I'm most proud of, and one of my most powerful ones, was, so as we were on the trip, we traveled with, in India, we traveled with the head of global nutrition for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a videographer. And at one day, Kristof was filming this video, and he needed to get scenes in the main city called Lucknow in Uttar Pradesh. And so he and the videographer were going to the city, and I asked if I could join the nutritionist we were with, and we had another translator, if we could go visit a village without him, because although it was awesome for me to be traveling with Nick, I also wanted to challenge myself to kind of do my own reporting without him, to kind of test what I was learning. And so I arrived in this very rural village with our nutritionist, and while I was walking through the village, I saw this child. This was about our third day in Uttar Pradesh. I saw this child that just looked huge, and I couldn't believe it. And I was like, oh my gosh, that baby is giant. And I talked to the nutritionist we were with, and I said, man, look at that baby. And it turned out that my perception had totally been thrown off by the children that I had been seeing in these villages the past 3 days. And this was probably the first healthy child that I had seen under the age of 5. And so this baby just looked giant to me. And then right down the road, about 100 feet down the road, I saw this child who was 5 years old, very thin, and clearly malnourished. And so I ended up going back to the household of the baby, who was very healthy, and got them to bring the babies together. One was 2.5 years old, one was 5 years old. And I had them pose next to each other because I thought visually it was such a strong representation.
It was. It's a powerful picture that you got there. Absolutely.
Thank you. So in that article, what I talked about, and I tried to illustrate it with the photo, was kind of the effects on nutrition from pre and postnatal care and breastfeeding, and how those practices, when they're not done in the most efficient and optimal way, that they can have huge repercussions for a child's nutrition. And so there's this kind of myth and practice and tradition in Indian culture that women don't start breastfeeding until 3 or 4 days in, and a lot of times they'll give babies water instead of milk on hot days, or they'll give pre-lactate of like honey because they don't think the colostrum is healthy, and these are all things that have huge repercussions. And I remember when I was writing my article, I read that like UNICEF had a stat that like 800,000 lives or child deaths are caused annually by suboptimal breastfeeding practices. And it's just, it's something you wouldn't think about. And then I had no idea that was the result of, so much malnutrition, where in Uttar Pradesh, there is over half of kids between the ages of when they're born and 5 years old are malnourished.
Well, there were some amazing stories that you and Nick got. I think Nick actually wrote the story about, but maybe it was you, about the eye surgery in Nepal. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of proud of that story because one of the references in that story was to the Moran Eye Clinic here in Salt Lake City. And how they were implementing the Nepalese model here because it was in fact superior to the standard U.S. model in certain circumstances where you couldn't use some of the high-tech equipment that is customarily used here. And I thought it was a brilliant piece.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we did a video from that eye clinic, and both of us wrote columns, and that was amazing. And what Kristof, I remember when we had a 5-hour drive from Kathmandu on like the bumpiest roads I've ever driven on out to this village in Hatauda where we were at this eye clinic. And I remember Kristof telling me on that drive that this was one of the few positive stories that had ever been told on a win a trip journey. So I was happy to see that. But it was so cool because I think after being in Baltimore and India and reporting on very heavy topics where at times the scale of the challenges seem so insurmountable, to see these two doctors that are having such global impact. I mean, the one doctor who Kristof did his column on, Dr. Sandhu Karit, he's done over 120,000 cataract surgeries. I mean, it just blows my mind. And I got to sit above the surgical table and watch these cataract surgeries, which can be done between like 5 and 7 minutes, and to just see a life change like that.
What's it like?
That was really inspiring.
Because you actually interviewed one woman before her surgery and then the next day, right? What was it like to see that change in her?
Oh yeah, it was incredible. So I went to her before she had surgery when she was in the waiting room, and I took photos of her and did a little interview and just heard about her life and how it had changed since she became visually impaired. And so many of these people are completely self-sufficient and before they lose their eyesight. And these are people who are living in very rural areas of Nepal on massive cliffs, and just being blind really totally makes them so impaired. And I remember doing that interview before she had her surgery, and she couldn't. She like asked what I looked like while I was sitting next to her. I was sitting right next to her, and she couldn't see me. And then the day after, when they had their bandages removed, she said I looked a lot better that day than I did the day before. So that was very cool.
Well, that is cool. And so her sight was restored that simply.
Yeah, just that simply. So the cataract hospital really worked almost like an assembly line, where they come in the door, they're passed to some nurses who get them scrubbed up. They cut their eyelashes. They put some eye drops to make sure there's no infection in the eye. And then they kind of get passed just one by one, passed down the chairs until they arrive on the surgical table. About 5-minute surgery, and then they get bandaged up. And the next morning we had about 60 or 70 people all sitting outside the eye hospital with bandages on, and one by one they got the bandages removed. And we would step back like 10 feet from somebody and say, how many fingers are we holding up? And almost pretty much every person got it perfectly right. And you could see them light up, and also all their families there too.
Well, it sounds like it was an amazing experience, Austin. And I'm a little jealous. I'll just tell you. And I think we just missed the cutoff. I think the deadline for this year's Win a Trip contest was Monday. And I'm not sure of that, but I think we're too late to help this year's applicants. But next year's applicants, I hope, will watch and enjoy this discussion. Austin, obviously, there are a lot of people, everyone who wanted this trip and didn't get it is jealous of you. They look up to you, see you as a role model. Who do you look up to? Who's your role model?
So I think I got to travel with him. I said Kristof is definitely a role model of mine. And I'd say the reason why, I'd say he became a role model to me in a different way, though, through this trip. And I really got to see how diligent and professional he is as a journalist, and how he really goes completely out of his way and takes so much time to just get a little bit more insight about an issue that he's reporting on. Like, for example, when we were in Baltimore and we were reporting on heroin addiction, we spent a decent amount of time in heroin addiction treatment centers talking to people about their life stories. And at one point he just said, kind of offhand, he's like, we're hearing from a lot of people who have sought out treatment, but I'm curious to hear from those who aren't. And so we were getting driven through the city by one of the health department, someone who worked at the health department. And he just told our driver to stop kind of on the side of the street. And there was kind of an encampment of people who are homeless. And Kristof walked out of the car, just went right up to them and kind of started engaging people in conversations and learning about the issues in Baltimore. And, that was just like, so it was so amazing to see as someone who's learning to be a journalist, because that's just one example of many that I saw on my trip, where he went out of his way to be uncomfortable and learn something about the issue he was reporting on. And I think that's the type of stuff that separates him as a journalist. So yeah, maybe that's a little
amazing. I want to get a little deeper with you, Austin. There are more famous journalists. Most of them are television journalists, right, that are more famous than Nick. And so I think about there's something that drew you to Nick, and I'm thinking it's the subject matter. And so I want to understand, why do you care about the welfare of the less advantaged? Why do you care about their stories?
So I think for me, I think I have, like I mentioned, like grown up with so much privilege. And I think my family, my two brothers and my parents have always been, there to like remind me of how fortunate I am. And when I started getting interested in stories related to global development, it really did strike me about how it's just like a lottery of birth. I was just any of these people, whether they're Syrian refugees or whether they're, the malnourished kids that I ran into in India. I have this just very visceral feeling that, that person could very easily be me. And so I get so inspired and like get so much personal fire from helping them tell their stories. And it's really interesting point in my life where I'm thinking about what I want to do, whether I want to be a journalist. I had so much respect and admiration for people who are, on the ground working with aid organizations and nonprofits, and think that maybe I want to try something like that. But either way, I just feel a conviction to help people, because I come from a place of privilege and opportunity, and I think it's what I'm meant to do is help give that to other people. And when I see that, stories that we were reporting on in India, about a rape case of one girl, when I see that and then see 3 weeks later when that column comes out and that New York Times reader had donated over $11,000 to this girl's case, I mean, like, that is so powerful. That is so powerful and makes it all worthwhile. And one thing that you asked me in your interview earlier for the article was about, referring to my success as a journalist. And I always want to say that, like, just because I had a byline in the New York Times does not make me successful. The part where I feel success was that, when I got a tweet from somebody who read my article and wanted to donate somewhere, or someone who wants to follow up and ask more questions about that. Because, if I'm in the paper, if I have a byline, that's great, but it's not really having its intended purpose. And I don't find myself successful unless it's actually having the impact down the road.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, one last question, Austin. We ask all of our guests for an impact hack, some tip, some idea to help us do more good in the world. And clearly, you've had an opportunity to learn from the master. You've been educated at the finest school in the world. Tell us, what have you learned that would help us have more impact?
So I'd say there's two little things that come to mind. One thing I like to do, and I think this relates to my last answer, is, so I've tried to get into like a meditation practice a little bit. I haven't been that great about it. But one thing I like to do is, before I start my day, just come up with 2 or 3 reasons that I'm grateful, gratitude. And it's not quite meditative, but it's like a way to just approach the day realizing, how great your life is. And I think that always inspires me to, like, kind of try to give other people the same things, to be the stuff that they can be grateful for as well. So that's something small, is just to really reflect on your own life and, think about what you should be grateful for. The other thing is that I've tried was, after my trip to Baltimore, and I did this reporting on this program called Thread, which was a mentorship program. I actually ended up signing up, and I'm now a mentor through this program called Big Brothers Big Sisters of the Bay Area. And that's just like it's such a fun little thing and great way to give back. I mentor this kid who's 11 years old, and after work some days or on a weekend, we'll go to a San Jose Sharks hockey game, or we'll just like play hoops in his front yard. And it's not the biggest impact thing in the world, but it's just a little way to give back. And I think that there are so many ways to do that, and whether it's volunteering your time to at a local school, or at a through a mentorship program like that, there are little ways that you can interact with people, see the impact you're having in their lives, have some fun doing it. And it's like these quick little wins,
Wow.
And it makes everyone win.
Well, Austin, I appreciate that. I love your tip about gratitude, because I think gratitude is such a powerful element in our lives. It just really is one of the most powerful emotions we can harness. Well, Austin, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Before we go, I want you to tell people how to find your columns on the New York Times website, and tell people how to track you down now that you're not there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I guess the best way to reach me is through Twitter, which my Twitter handle is right there, at Austin Meyer 17, and I would love to talk to anyone. And then to find New York Times columns, if you just go into Google and type New York Times Austin Meyer, you should be directed to a page that has all my blogs. Please check them out. I think you might be interested and learn some stuff. And yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Austin. It's been a joy to have you. Appreciate you taking the time to share your stories, and we wish you every success in your career.
Thank you so much, Devin. I appreciate it.
All righty, let's do some good.